The chandeliers of the grand ballroom at the Astoria glittered like captive constellations, their light refracting through 1,000 crystal flutes of champagne. The air was thick with the scent of money, a cloying mix of expensive perfume, hothouse lilies, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Tonight, this cathedral of old-world wealth was celebrating Judge Daniel Washington. He stood at a podium, the weight of the Justice Luminary Award a solid, cold presence in his hand. His tuxedo was immaculate, his posture as unyielding as the marble columns flanking the stage. At 52, his face was a landscape carved by discipline and quiet resolve, a stark contrast to the soft, pampered features of the city's elite who applauded him. His wife, Sarah, watched from their table, her smile a beacon of genuine warmth in the ocean of curated pleasantries. Beside her, their daughter, Jasmine, a freshman at Georgetown, vibrated with pride, her phone held aloft to capture the moment. Daniel's speech was brief, elegant, and devoid of the self-congratulation that usually define these events. He spoke of justice, not as a destination, but as a direction, a constant, difficult journey toward a more perfect union. "He's so regal," Jasmine whispered to her mother. Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. "He's earned it." As the applause, polite but fervent, began to subside, the event's host, a silver-haired philanthropist whose family had owned half the city for a century, returned to the microphone. "And now, we have a surprise tribute, a young leader in our community who insisted on saying a few words. Please welcome Ms. Madison Whitmore." A ripple of interest went through the room. The Whitmores were not just wealthy, they were a dynasty. Richard Whitmore, Madison's father, sat at a ringside table, his face a mask of predatory satisfaction. He controlled a sprawling empire of real estate and private equity, a man who didn't attend events so much as preside over them. Madison ascended the stage, a vision in emerald silk that shimmered under the lights. She was impossibly beautiful, her features sculpted with the casual perfection that comes from generations of selective breeding and limitless resources. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, taking the podium and flashing a smile that was both dazzling and utterly devoid of warmth. "Thank you," she began, her voice a low, melodious purr that carried to every corner of the vast room. "It is such an honor to be here tonight, celebrating a man of Judge Washington's unique achievements." Daniel, who had returned to his seat, inclined his head slightly, his expression professionally placid. "When I think of the judge," Madison continued, her gaze sweeping the room before locking onto him, "I think of the concept of legacy, how some are built over generations, brick by brick, through hardship and vision, and how others can be dismantled so very quickly." The room grew quiet. The pleasant murmur of conversation died. Something was wrong. This wasn't the fawning tribute they expected. "It reminds me of a story my father tells," Madison said, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "A local tragedy, from long ago. The Franklin steel collapse. A cautionary tale. Really. About what can happen when ambition is untethered from tradition." At the mention of Franklin steel, a deep, cellular coldness seized Daniel. It was as if a ghost from a locked room in his memory had just walked through the wall and laid an icy hand on his heart. He didn't flinch. His posture remained unchanged, his hands resting calmly on the table. But Sarah saw it. She saw the infinitesimal tightening around his eyes, the sudden, sharp stillness that fell over him. She reached for his hand under the table, her fingers finding his cold as stone. Madison's eyes, a pale, chilling blue, were fixed on Daniel's. She was speaking only to him now, the rest of the room merely an audience for a deeply personal execution. A once great company, a pillar of the community, brought to its knees. So many lives ruined. A family shattered. All because one young man, from a less traditional background, saw a chance to make a name for himself. He didn't understand the delicate ecosystem he was destroying. The insult was a masterpiece of cruelty, a stiletto blade wrapped in velvet. To the uninitiated, it was a vaguely inappropriate historical reference. To Daniel, and to the smirking Richard Whitmore, it was a declaration of war. She had taken the worst moment of his professional life, a moment of profound moral conflict and lingering grief, and twisted it into a weapon, using it to humiliate him in front of his family, his peers, his entire world. She raised her champagne flute. So, let us toast Judge Washington, a true testament to how far one can rise. A man who truly understands the cost of progress. A tense, uncertain smattering of applause followed. Madison descended the stairs, her emerald dress flowing behind her like a toxic cloud. She didn't look at Daniel again. She didn't need to. The poison had been delivered. The host, flustered, quickly moved the evening along. But the damage was done. The atmosphere in the room had curdled. Jasmine looked at her father, her brow furrowed with confusion and worry. Dad, what was she talking about? Daniel's gaze was distant, seeing not the glittering ballroom, but the gray, soot-stained sky of a dying factory town 2 decades ago. He blinked, slowly, bringing himself back to the present. He squeezed Sarah's hand, a silent acknowledgement of her support, then turned to his daughter. He gave her a small, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just a ghost story. Jazz. Some people prefer living in the past. But as he looked across the room, his eyes met Richard Whitmore's. The older man raised his glass in a silent, mocking salute. In that moment, the unspoken truth was laid bare between them. This wasn't about a long-dead company. This was a vendetta, and it was far from over. Daniel held Whitmore's gaze, his own expression hardening from placid composure into something else entirely, something forged in the deserts of Afghanistan and honed in the crucible of federal court. It was a look of absolute, unyielding resolve. The battle had been joined. The question, hanging in the opulent, suffocating air, was no longer what Madison meant, but what Judge Daniel Washington was going to do about it. The drive home was a study in taut silence. The rhythmic swish of the wipers against a light drizzle did little to dispel the tension coiled in the car's interior. Jasmine, sensing the gravity of the unspoken, scrolled through her phone in the back seat, her usual cheerful chatter conspicuously absent. Sarah drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel, occasionally glancing at her husband. Daniel stared out the passenger window, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon and gold. The glittering facade of the gala had been stripped away, leaving behind the raw, ugly framework of memory. Franklin Steele. The name was a key. Unlocking a vault he had kept sealed for over 20 years. Inside were images he could never erase, the smell of rust and decay hanging over a shuttered factory, the hollow-eyed despair of laid-off workers, and the face of a young man, barely older than Jasmine was now, pleading with him in a sterile courthouse hallway. Thomas Whitmore, Richard's younger brother. He felt Sarah's hand on his arm. "Daniel, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, the words automatic, a shield he had perfected over a lifetime. "No, you're not," she countered softly. "I haven't seen you look like that since, well, since a long time ago." He turned to her, the streetlights illuminating the worry etched on her face. It was a long time ago. Sarah. It should have stayed there. When they arrived home, the modest, comfortable familiarity of their house felt like a sanctuary. The hallway was lined not with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, but with framed photographs of family vacations, military commendations, and Jasmine's art projects from elementary school. It was a life built, not inherited. After Jasmine had gone upstairs, her worried good night, Dad lingering in the air, Sarah found Daniel in his study. He stood before a locked filing cabinet, his back to her. "You're going to open it, aren't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't turn around. They brought it back into the light. Sarah. Not me. He worked the combination lock, the metallic clicks echoing in the quiet room. The drawer slid open with a soft groan, releasing the faint, musty scent of old paper and stale ink. He reached inside and pulled out a single, thick accordion file, its label, handwritten in his own younger, sharper script, reading simply U.S. v. Franklin Steel Corp. He carried it to his large mahogany desk, the wood worn smooth by years of work. He sat down, the leather of his chair creaking a familiar complaint. Sarah came and stood behind him, her hands resting on his shoulders, a silent, unshakable presence. He untied the faded red ribbon and opened the file. The top document was a newspaper clipping from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, dated 22 years ago. The headline was stark: Franklin Steel shutters. CEO indicted in fraud probe. Thousands jobless. Beside the column of text was a grainy black-and-white photo of a much younger Daniel, then an assistant U.S. attorney, his face grim and determined as he walked into the federal courthouse. Beneath the clipping were stacks of legal documents, witness depositions, and financial audits filled with labyrinthine columns of numbers that told a simple story of greed and betrayal. And tucked away in a separate sleeve were his personal notes, filled with the doubts and moral quandaries that never made it into the official record. He remembered the case as if it were yesterday. He had been a rising star in the prosecutor's office, hungry and idealistic, determined to hold the powerful accountable. Franklin Steel had been the lifeblood of its community for a century, but it was rotting from the inside. A massive pension fraud scheme had been uncovered, siphoning away the life savings of 3,000 workers. The evidence pointed squarely at the company's CEO, a man named Marcus Thorne, and its patriarch and chairman of the board, Richard Whitmore Sr., Richard and Thomas's father. "I tried to offer the father a deal," Daniel murmured, his voice raspy with memory. "Testify against Thorne, return the stolen funds, and we'd recommend a lighter sentence. He was the architect of the whole thing. Thorne was just his puppet." "What did he do?" Sarah asked, her hands gently kneading the tension in his shoulders. "He laughed in my face," Daniel said, a flicker of the old anger returning. "He told me that Whitmores don't make deals with people like me." Then he threw his own partner, Thorne, under the bus and used his army of lawyers to pin everything on him. He walked away without a scratch, a pillar of the community. But the company was ruined. The factory closed. The town died a slow, painful death. And the Whitmore family was not entirely unscathed. The scandal had tarnished the family name, and the financial fallout, though manageable for the patriarch, was devastating for his younger son, Thomas, who had invested his entire personal fortune trying to save the company he genuinely loved. Daniel's fingers found another clipping, this one smaller. From a few months later, tragedy strikes prominent family. Thomas Whitmore, 26, dead in boating accident. The official report called it an accident, but the whispers in the town were of a young man broken by shame and financial ruin, who had taken his own life in despair. Richard, the older brother, had been overseas at the time, building his own separate empire. He returned to a shattered family, a dead brother, and a father who refused to accept any blame. It was easier, Daniel realized, for Richard to create a different villain. "He blames me," Daniel said, the realization settling like a shroud. In his mind, my investigation, my ambition, killed his brother. He's been nursing this hatred for 22 years. "But it was his own father who destroyed the company," Sarah said, her voice filled with a quiet fury. "His father who betrayed everyone." "Grief doesn't always listen to facts," Daniel replied wearily. He closed the file. The ghosts momentarily banished. Richard has constructed a narrative that protects his family's legacy. In his story, I'm the villain, the outsider who destroyed their world. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet, tree-lined street of his neighborhood. It was a world away from the suffocating opulence of the Whitmores. Madison's speech tonight, that wasn't just a random insult. It was the opening salvo. "They're coming after me, Sarah, with everything they have." "Why now?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "After all this time." "My name is being floated for the Circuit Court of Appeals," he said. "A lifetime appointment. That's a level of influence Richard can't control, can't buy. He can't allow the man he blames for his family's tragedy to ascend to one of the highest courts in the land. For him, this isn't just about revenge anymore. It's about stopping me." He turned to face her, his eyes clear and resolute. The weariness was gone, replaced by the familiar steel he reserved for the battlefield and the courtroom. He thinks this is his fight to win. He thinks he can break me with whispers and old tragedies. A grim smile touched Daniel's lips. He has no idea who he's dealing with. The first attack came 2 days later, a surgical strike disguised as journalism. It appeared in an online tabloid known for its political assassinations. Under a headline designed for maximum damage, Judge Washington's controversial past, did a personal vendetta destroy a Pennsylvania town? The article was a masterful blend of half-truths and malicious innuendo. It reframed the Franklin Steele case, painting Daniel as a ruthlessly ambitious prosecutor who targeted a beloved family-owned business to advance his career. It featured anonymous quotes from former employees lamenting the judge's overzealous tactics, and included a heart-wrenching, exclusive interview with Richard Whitmore himself. "My brother, Thomas, was a visionary," Richard said, his quoted words dripping with manufactured sorrow. "He poured his heart and soul into that company. He was trying to save it. This young prosecutor, he didn't care about justice. He cared about headlines. The stress of that unjust persecution cost my brother his life. I'm speaking out now because a man with that kind of history has no place on a federal bench, let alone a higher court." The article was poison, and it spread quickly through the bloodstream of social media. Madison Whitmore shared it on her platforms with a simple, devastating comment. The truth always comes out. Her millions of followers, a curated army of the wealthy, the aspirational, and the resentful, amplified the message. Hashtags began to trend. Justice for Franklin Steele. Activist Judge Washington. Inside the sterile, echoing tension of his chambers at the federal courthouse, where the weight of past judgments seemed to linger in the marble, Daniel read the article on his computer screen. His face was a mask of calm. His law clerk, Anna Rodriguez, a brilliant, fiercely loyal young woman from the top of her class at Yale, was not so composed. She paced in front of his desk, her hands clenched. "This is a lie, Judge. It's a complete fabrication. We have to issue a statement, a rebuttal. We have to fight back." Daniel swiveled in his chair, his gaze steady. fighting on their terms. Anna is a losing proposition. They control the narrative in that world. We fight in ours. And what world is that, sir? She asked, her frustration palpable. The world of facts, Daniel said simply. He minimized the article, his focus already shifting. The Whitmore Empire. It's a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore holdings, and private equity firms. Richard inherited his father's talent for creative accounting, but not his subtlety. He's arrogant, and arrogant men make mistakes. I want you to start digging. Discreetly. I want to know everything. Every transaction, every subsidiary, every government contract. Anna's eyes lit up, the frustration replaced by a familiar fire. Consider it done. Judge. As she left, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a text from Evelyn Reed, an old friend and one of the few investigative journalists left who valued truth over clicks. She had been a cub reporter covering the Franklin Steele case all those years ago. Saw the hit piece. Vultures are circling. They're trying to rewrite history. Call me. He dialed her number. Evelyn, he said, his voice warm with old familiarity. Daniel, she replied, her tone brisk and professional. I trust you're not planning to let this stand. I'm planning to do more than that, he said. I need your help. You knew that case better than anyone. There were things I could never prove. Whispers about Richard Whitmore Sr. that never made it into the record. You mean the rumors that he was gutting the company from the inside long before you ever showed up? Evelyn asked, her voice sharp with interest. That he set up Marcus Thorne to take the fall for his own crimes. Exactly, Daniel confirmed. I could never find the paper trail. His lawyers were masters at burying things. But 22 years is a long time. Digital records, old servers, disgruntled employees. Things have a way of surfacing. You think Richard Jr. knows the truth about his father? Evelyn asked. No, Daniel said, a certainty in his voice. I think the father built a lie, and the son built a shrine on top of it. A lie that powerful is fragile. I want to find the crack in the foundation. I'll start digging, Evelyn promised. Let's see what skeletons are in the Whitmore family closet. That evening, the attacks escalated from the digital to the personal. As Daniel and Sarah were leaving a restaurant after a quiet dinner, they were ambushed by a cameraman from the same tabloid. The flashbulb was blinding. Judge Washington, the man shouted, shoving a microphone in his face. Is it true you drove Thomas Whitmore to suicide? Do you have any comment for the thousands of families whose lives you destroyed? Daniel put a protective arm around Sarah, shielding her from the camera's glare. His face was impassive, but a cold fury burned within him. He guided her toward their car, his silence more powerful than any shouted denial. They're trying to bait you, Sarah said once they were safely inside, her voice trembling slightly. They want you to lose your composure. I know, Daniel said, his jaw tight. He started the car, his movements precise and controlled. They think they can win by making me angry. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, his eyes dark with resolve. They've mistaken my patience for weakness. That is a grave miscalculation. The next morning, the pressure intensified. A conservative senator, a man known to be deep in Richard Whitmore's pocket, went on television and publicly called for an inquiry into Daniel's fitness for the bench. These are serious allegations, the senator said, his face a mask of false concern. The American people deserve to know if a federal judge used his power to settle personal scores. The battle lines were now clearly drawn. The Whitmores were leveraging their immense political and media power to orchestrate a full-scale assault on his reputation, his career, and his legacy. They were turning his greatest strength, his unwavering commitment to the law, into a weapon against him. But Daniel was a student of strategy, trained not only in law, but in warfare. He knew that a direct assault could be a feint, designed to distract from a vulnerability elsewhere. And, as Anna's preliminary research began to trickle in, outlining the dizzying complexity of Whitmore Industries' financial structures, he began to see the faint outlines of his true target. Richard Whitmore hadn't just inherited his father's vendetta, he had inherited his criminal playbook. And somewhere in that maze of numbers, Daniel knew, was the truth. Not just the truth about Franklin Steele, but the truth that would bring a dynasty to its knees. The official announcement came on a crisp autumn morning. Standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, the President of the United States nominated Judge Daniel Washington for a seat on the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, often considered the second most powerful court in the nation. It was the culmination of a lifetime of service, a profound honor that should have been a moment of pure triumph. Instead, it was a signal for the Whitmore war machine to engage its main cannons. Within an hour of the announcement, Richard Whitmore released a formal statement, distributed to every major news outlet. While I respect the President's prerogative, the nomination of Daniel Washington is a grave insult to the memory of my brother and the thousands of victims of his judicial overreach. My family and I will use every resource at our disposal to oppose this confirmation. We will not stand by while a man of such questionable character is elevated to one of our nation's highest courts. The statement was a formal declaration of war, and it transformed the confirmation process from a routine political procedure into a national spectacle. The battleground was set: the Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearing. In his chambers, Daniel watched the news reports with a detached calm that unnerved his staff. While they buzzed with frantic energy, drafting press releases and fielding calls from concerned allies, he was the quiet center of the storm. "They're framing it as a character issue," Anna said, pointing to a television screen where a political pundit was gravely discussing the Franklin Steele controversy. "They're making this entire hearing about a case from 22 years ago." "Good," Daniel said, turning away from the screen. Anna stared at him, bewildered. "Good, Judge. They're going to crucify you on national television." "They're going to try," Daniel corrected her gently. "But in doing so, they are giving me the one thing I need: a formal, public forum where the rules of evidence, not the rules of public relations, apply. They are bringing the Franklin Steele case into my courtroom." His strategy began to crystallize. This wouldn't be a defensive battle. It would be a prosecution. His target wasn't just his own confirmation. It was the entire rotten edifice of the Whitmore legacy. His days became a relentless campaign of preparation. With Anna, he delved into the minutiae of the Whitmore financial empire. Her research uncovered a pattern of aggressive acquisitions, hostile takeovers, and leveraged buyouts that left a trail of shuttered businesses and discarded employees. It was the Franklin Steele model, scaled up for the 21st century. "He's a predator, just like his father," Anna observed, highlighting a particularly ruthless transaction. "But he's been shielded by an army of lawyers and accountants. The paper trail is a ghost." Simultaneously, Daniel worked with Evelyn Reed, who was chasing down the ghosts of the past. She flew to the dying husk of the Pennsylvania town where Franklin Steele had once stood. She spent days in dusty library archives, poring over microfiche of old property records and business filings. She tracked down retired factory workers and former executives, most of whom were too scared or too broken to talk. Then, she found him. A man named Arthur Pym, the former chief accountant for Franklin Steele, now in his late 70s. He was living in a quiet retirement community in Florida, a man haunted by a silence he had kept for over 2 decades. He was terrified. Evelyn told Daniel over a secure phone line, said Richard Whitmore Sr. threatened to ruin him and his family if he ever spoke a word. But he's old now, and his conscience is weighing on him. He kept a second set of ledgers. Daniel. Hidden ones. It was the breakthrough they needed. The ledgers, which Pym had kept hidden in a safe deposit box for 22 years, detailed a systematic campaign of embezzlement by Richard Whitmore Sr. He had been siphoning millions out of the company for years, bleeding it dry while propping it up with the employees' pension funds. He had framed his own CEO, Marcus Thorne, and allowed the company to collapse to cover his tracks. "But there's more," Evelyn said, her voice dropping. Pym said Thomas, the younger brother, discovered what his father was doing. He confronted him. There was a terrible fight. The father disowned him, cut him off completely. According to Pym, Thomas wasn't just financially ruined. He was destroyed by the knowledge that his own father was a thief who had betrayed thousands of people. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Thomas Whitmore's death wasn't about a zealous prosecutor. It was about a monstrous father. Richard Jr., shielded from the truth, had spent half his life avenging the wrong man for the wrong crime. While Evelyn secured a sworn affidavit from Arthur Pym, Daniel focused on his own preparation. He met with the White House counsel and the senators who would be leading his confirmation. He answered their questions about the Franklin Steele case with calm, factual precision, but he held his most powerful evidence in reserve. He knew Richard Whitmore would not be content to fight through proxies. He would want to deliver the killing blow himself. His prediction came true a week before the hearing. Richard Whitmore, in a move of stunning arrogance, formally requested to testify before the Judiciary Committee as a character witness against Daniel Washington's nomination. The ranking member of the committee, an old friend and colleague of Daniel's, called him immediately. "Daniel, this is highly unusual. It turns the hearing into a trial. Are you sure you want to go through with this? We can try to block his testimony." "No," Daniel said firmly. "Let him testify. Let him say everything he wants to say, on the record, under oath." The senator was silent for a moment. Then, a slow smile crept into his voice. "You have a plan, don't you?" "I have the truth," Daniel replied, "and I intend to use it." The night before the hearing, the weight of the coming confrontation was immense. Daniel sat in his study, the Franklin Steele file open on his desk one last time. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting for the memory of Thomas Whitmore, a young man betrayed by his own blood. He was fighting for the 3,000 families whose lives had been upended by the Whitmore family's greed. And he was fighting for the very principle that had guided his entire life, that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, must be brought into the light. Sarah came in and stood behind him, her presence a silent fortress of support. "Are you ready?" she asked. He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the deep, steady resolve of a man about to walk into battle. "I've been ready for 22 years." The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was a theater of power, its soaring ceilings and dark wood paneling designed to intimidate and impress. The air was thick with a mixture of hushed anticipation and the low hum of television cameras broadcasting the proceedings live to the nation. At the center of it all, Daniel Washington sat alone at the witness table, a figure of unshakable composure in a sea of political maneuvering. His family, Sarah and Jasmine, sat in the front row of the public gallery, their faces etched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Across the room, in the seats reserved for the next witness, sat the Whitmore contingent, Richard, his face a mask of grim righteousness, and Madison, seated beside him, a portrait of cool, predatory confidence. She caught Daniel's eye and gave him a slow, deliberate smile that promised his destruction. The morning was a grueling marathon of questioning from the senators. Those in his party praised his impeccable record, his military service, his judicial temperament. Those in the opposition clearly fed Richard Whitmore's talking points, hammered away at the Franklin Steele case. They quoted from the tabloid article, casting him as a callous careerist who built his success on the ruins of a community. Through it all, Daniel remained serene. He answered each question with precision and patience, his voice calm and measured. He never raised his voice, never showed a flicker of anger. He simply stated the facts of the case as they were known, refusing to be drawn into speculation or personal attacks. He was laying the foundation, brick by painstaking brick. Then, in the early afternoon, the chairman announced the next witness. The committee now calls Mr. Richard Whitmore. A hush fell over the room as Richard made his way to the witness table, his expensive suit radiating an aura of immense power and influence. He was sworn in, his hand on the Bible, a study in performative piety. For the next hour, he gave the performance of a lifetime. His voice, thick with emotion, painted a vivid picture of a beloved younger brother, a vibrant family business, and a community destroyed by the reckless ambition of a single prosecutor. He spoke of his brother's despair, his family's shame, and the long shadow the tragedy had cast over his life. He was charismatic, compelling, and utterly convincing. Daniel Washington, he concluded, his voice breaking with practiced grief as he looked directly at the nominee, is a man who prioritizes his own advancement over human decency. He is a man who lacks the character, the empathy, and the moral compass required for a lifetime appointment to the second highest court in our land. For the sake of my brother's memory, and for the sake of American justice, I urge this committee to reject his nomination. He had delivered a powerful, devastating blow. The room was silent, the senators on the opposition side looking grimly satisfied. Madison watched Daniel, her eyes gleaming with triumph. The chairman cleared his throat. Judge Washington, as the nominee, you have the right to question the witness. Do you wish to do so? This was the moment. The entire battle hinged on the next few minutes. Daniel rose slowly, his movements deliberate. He did not approach the witness table with the aggression of a prosecutor, but with the calm authority of a teacher. I do, Mr. Chairman, he said, his voice resonating with a quiet power that commanded the room's absolute attention. He turned to Richard Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, he began, his tone respectful. Thank you for your testimony. I want to express my sincere condolences for the loss of your brother, Thomas. His death was a tragedy that I have carried with me for many years. Richard grunted, taken aback by the disarming sincerity. Your condolences are 22 years too late. Judge. Perhaps, Daniel said evenly. You testified that your brother was trying to save Franklin Steele. Is that correct? He poured his life into it. Richard affirmed, and you believe that my prosecution of the company's pension fraud directly led to its collapse and his subsequent death. I don't just believe it. I know it, Richard said, his voice hard as iron. Mr. Whitmore, Daniel continued, his voice still gentle. Were you aware that in the 2 years leading up to my investigation, over $50 million were systematically funneled out of Franklin Steele's accounts into a series of untraceable offshore shell corporations? A flicker of confusion crossed Richard's face. That's preposterous. The company was struggling, but there was no theft. The blame for the collapse fell on Marcus Thorne. Indeed it did. Daniel agreed. He turned to the chairman. Mr. Chairman, I would like to enter into the record Exhibit A sworn affidavit from Mr. Arthur Pym, the former chief accountant of Franklin Steel. He handed a document to the committee clerk, who projected it onto the large screens in the hearing room. The affidavit was displayed for all to see, along with excerpts from the hidden ledgers. Mr. Pym testifies under penalty of perjury, Daniel explained, his voice gaining a sharp, clinical edge, that these offshore accounts were controlled by one man, and it was not Marcus Thorne, the man who embezzled $50 million from his own company, the man who plundered his employees' pensions, was the chairman of the board, your father, Richard Whitmore Sr. A collective gasp went through the room. Richard Whitmore shot to his feet. This is an outrage. You're slandering the name of a dead man. Please sit down, Mr. Whitmore, the chairman instructed, his voice stern. Daniel waited for him to comply, his gaze unwavering. My investigation, Mr. Whitmore, was not targeting your brother. It was targeting your father. He was the architect of the entire criminal enterprise. Lies, Richard spat, his face turning a blotchy red. My father was a titan of industry, a philanthropist. He was also a thief, Daniel stated flatly. He gestured to the screen again. Mr. Chairman, Exhibit B. An image appeared on the screen, a scanned copy of a handwritten letter. The handwriting was elegant, but frantic. This letter, Mr. Whitmore, was written by your brother, Thomas. It was sent to a college friend a week before he died. It was provided to my team by that friend, who has carried this burden for 2 decades. Daniel's voice softened, filled with a profound sadness. He began to read from the letter. He's a monster. John. I confronted him with the ledgers. I showed him the proof of what he'd done. He didn't deny it. He just laughed. He called me weak and sentimental. He said the workers were sheep who deserved to be fleeced. He told me I was no longer his son. He has destroyed everything I ever believed in. The company, our family's name. It's all built on a lie. I don't know how I can go on living with this knowledge. The room was utterly silent. Every eye was on Richard Whitmore, whose face had crumpled. The mask of righteous anger replaced by a horrifying, dawning comprehension. The narrative he had built his life around, the vendetta that had fueled him for 2 decades, was disintegrating before his eyes on national television. Madison stared at the screen, then at her father, her own face a canvas of shock and disbelief. Daniel delivered the final, devastating blow, his voice now filled not with anger, but with a deep, sorrowful pity. Your father didn't just steal from his employees. Mr. Whitmore, he destroyed his own son. Thomas didn't die because of my investigation. He died because his heart was broken by the man he admired most. Your father let Marcus Thorne go to prison, and let the world blame me, all to cover his own monstrous crimes. He sacrificed his son's legacy to protect his own. He paused, letting the full weight of the truth settle upon the room. The vendetta you have waged against me for 22 years has been based on a terrible lie, a lie your father created. The villain in your story was never me. It was him. Richard Whitmore stared at Daniel, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside, a collapsing ruin of a man. He slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The chairman banged his gavel, the sound cracking through the stunned silence. The committee will take a recess. But no one moved. They were all transfixed by the raw, brutal spectacle of a dynasty's complete and utter self-destruction. Daniel Washington stood tall, his duty done, He had not only defended his name, he had reclaimed the truth, and in doing so, he had proven, beyond any doubt, exactly what kind of judge he was. The aftermath was swift and absolute. The dam of the Whitmore legacy, cracked wide open by Daniel's revelations, burst apart, unleashing a torrent of consequences. Richard Whitmore's televised breakdown became an iconic moment of public disgrace. The Department of Justice, citing the new evidence presented at the hearing, immediately launched a full-scale criminal investigation, not just into the cold case of Franklin Steele, but into the entire financial apparatus of Whitmore Industries. Daniel's nomination to the Circuit Court was confirmed by the Senate in a stunningly rapid, unanimous vote. The senators who had attacked him just days before now tripped over themselves to offer public apologies and praise his integrity. He had become a national symbol of quiet strength and moral courage. The fallout for the Whitmores was catastrophic. Richard was arrested on charges of perjury, obstruction of justice, and his role in a decades-long corporate conspiracy. Federal agents raided the gleaming glass tower of Whitmore Industries, carrying out boxes of evidence as a stunned media scrum looked on. The family's assets, a fortune built on generations of ruthless acquisition and a foundation of fraud, were frozen. The empire crumbled to dust in a matter of days. Madison was caught in the inferno, hounded by reporters, her name now synonymous with a lie. She became a pariah. The social circles that had once fawned over her now shunned her. Her influential friends disappeared. Her carefully constructed world of privilege and power had been a mirage, and it had vanished, leaving her utterly alone in a harsh, unforgiving desert of truth. Weeks later, Daniel and Sarah stood in the quiet of their living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. The whirlwind had passed, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The Justice Luminary Award sat on the mantelpiece, no longer a symbol of a battle to come, but a testament to a battle won. "It's over," Sarah said softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "The fight is," Daniel agreed, "but the work isn't." He was true to his word. As the legal proceedings against the Whitmore estate progressed, a significant portion of the seized assets was allocated to a victims' compensation fund. The first checks went to the surviving pensioners of Franklin Steele and their families, a measure of justice delivered more than 2 decades late. But Daniel had a further vision. He worked with the federal trustees to repurpose the most ostentatious symbol of the Whitmores' undeserved wealth, their sprawling 50-acre estate, the manicured gardens where Madison had once commanded peacocks, the marble halls lined with portraits of their stern-faced ancestors. It was all to be transformed. Months turned into a year. On a bright, clear autumn day, 2 years after the hearing, Daniel stood once again at a podium. This time, he was not in a suffocatingly opulent ballroom, but on the wide, welcoming steps of the former Whitmore mansion. The brass plaque on the stone gate now read, "The Thomas Whitmore Center for Corporate Ethics and Justice." The crowd before him was not the city's elite, but a diverse gathering of law students, community activists, union leaders, and the families from the old Franklin Steele town. Jasmine stood beside him, now a law student herself at Georgetown, her eyes shining with an admiration that went deeper than a daughter's pride. "This place," Daniel said, his voice carrying over the assembled crowd, "was once a monument to a legacy built on a lie. Today, we rededicate it to the truth. We name it not for the man who built the lie, but for the son who died for it. The Thomas Whitmore Center will serve as a permanent reminder that justice is not a weapon for the ambitious, but a shield for the vulnerable. It will be a place of learning, of advocacy, of ensuring that a tragedy like the one that befell Franklin Steele never happens again." He used his power not to gloat, not to punish further, but to heal, to build something new and hopeful from the wreckage of the old. It was the ultimate act of empowerment, the final, definitive answer to the poison whispered at the gala. From the edge of the crowd, a young woman in simple, unassuming clothes watched, half hidden by the shade of an old oak tree. It was Madison. She had lost everything: her name, her fortune, her father. In the crucible of that loss, she had been forced to confront the emptiness of her own character. She had started therapy, begun volunteering at a legal aid clinic, taking the first, faltering steps on a long, arduous path toward becoming someone of substance. She had received a simple, unsigned invitation to the dedication ceremony. She knew it had come from him. It was not an act of forgiveness that had to be earned, but an act of grace, an invitation to witness what could be built when a legacy of hate was replaced by a commitment to justice. As Daniel finished his speech to thunderous applause, his eyes scanned the crowd. For a brief moment, his gaze met Madison's. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was an acknowledgement, not of victory, but of a shared, difficult history that had ended not in mutual destruction, but in the possibility of redemption. Madison returned the nod, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Then, she turned and walked away, not back toward the ruins of her past, but toward an unknown, unwritten future she would have to build for herself, brick by painful, honest brick. Daniel watched her go, then turned his attention back to the center, to the students with bright, hopeful faces, to the promise of a better future. The cycle of vengeance was broken. In its place, he had forged a new legacy, one not of inherited wealth or bitter revenge, but of earned integrity, restorative justice, and the enduring power of truth.